Good morning.
Good morning.
It is I know everyone is tired because it's Monday, and on Mondays we get tired. However, there's a brand new episode of the Dear Church podcast. Very exciting. Today we're talking about Dance Dance Evolution. So,
Dance
did you ever
Evolution?
play that game DDR? You never played Dance Dance Revolution?
Nope.
That's neither here nor there. We're talking about evolution today. So sit back and relax. You're listening to the Dear Church podcast. Welcome to the Dear Church podcast, where we exist to fill your ears and your minds with the study of God to see the world as disciples of Christ. My name is Samuel.
What's my name?
And you are Pastor Eugene. And I just want to say, what a Monday. So, Pastor Eugene, I feel like I haven't asked you this question in a long time. How have you been doing in the last couple of weeks? Because we've been doing, podcasts, but we never asked you how you're doing.
Same old.
Same old.
It's always exciting. It's always fantastic. I'm always at the edge of my seat. Same old.
Yeah, me too. Same old. Today, Pastor Eugene, we're going to be talking about the big question of evolution. And I'm very excited for this episode because I've heard a lot about this topic and people have asked a lot of questions regarding this just in the past couple of years. But the big question that I do want to eventually get to is, how are Christians to think about science? So that is science.
Science?
Yes. So that is the biggest question that we're going to try to attack from multiple different angles. Not attack. We're going to try to answer from multiple different angles. But today we're going to be starting with evolution. And I think in many conversations pertaining to evolution and Darwinism, it's always science versus religion. I was reading a short book on evolution by the National Academy of Sciences, in preparation for this podcast. And they're constantly putting the Christian faith and science against one another. They say they don't, but they really are. They believe, they believe in this, and they reject scientific facts, or science says otherwise. And so it seems like the conversation on evolution, it's just science and the Bible are held on the same level, with science being considered new, modern, evidence-based, factual, and the Bible just being old, outdated, faith-driven. You just have to blindly believe no matter what the facts might say. So we're going to try to answer some questions on evolution today. But I guess before we jump into those questions, I wanted to just briefly go over what evolution even is. So when we say evolution, what do we mean by that? Did you want to answer this one? Because I had some.
Yeah, why don't you answer it
Okay.
then, if you have something?
I had a couple different sources on the definition of evolution. This is from that book that I was talking about from the National Academy of Sciences called Science, Evolution, and Creationism. Evolution refers to changes in the traits of organisms over multiple generations. Oxford Languages defines it as the process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed and diversified from earlier forms during the history of the Earth. And this is from the Baker Compact Dictionary of Theological Terms. Theory that all life originated from non-living material and has developed according to natural selection and speciation as random mutations affect changes without purpose or design over billions of years. I thought these three kind of bring different aspects of evolution to the table. Obviously, the last one is Christian, meaning it's getting at certain things that Christians disagree with on the topic of evolution. However, I wanted to hear Pastor Eugene's definition of evolution.
Evolution just means we're getting better and better over time. And it depends on what schema you want to put evolution in. If you want to put it where you initially defined it as the biological evolution,
Yeah.
then it's talking about the source of life, which is, or the origins of life, which is where Darwinistic evolution gets into. And so this is why people like, I don't know, Richard Dawkins and these other famous atheists,
Hmm.
they love evolution because it gives people a reason
Uh-huh.
of the beginning of our life without religion. So this gives atheists an amazing kind of, you know, confidence, and I don't want to say hope, but it really is. It really is something that they can be proud of. So they can hold on to something intellectual. I'm going to give you a quote. So this is by Richard Dawkins, and it's from his writings, The Greatest Show on Earth. Richard Dawkins is a very, very famous atheist, by the way. Recently, he came out on the news and he lost his humanitarian award because he didn't support transgenderism.
You can lose awards like that. Wow.
Apparently, retroactively take it away. But yeah,
Just like the Heisman. Wow. Okay. This is by Richard Dawkins. Evolution is a fact. Beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane, informed, intelligent doubt, beyond doubt, evolution is a fact. The evidence for evolution is at least as strong as the evidence for the Holocaust, even allowing for eyewitnesses to the Holocaust. It is the plain truth that we are cousins of chimpanzees, somewhat more distant cousins of monkeys, more distant cousins still of aardvarks and manatees, yet more distant cousins of bananas and turnips. I like manatees, but that was the end of the quote, right?
yeah.
He doesn't say anything there.
Well, I mean, he's saying that evolution is a fact. So he's saying that. So what he is doing in this writing is he's putting the onus now on the theory, not saying here's the theory and we're going to defend it. He's saying here's the theory and it's a fact. In fact, it's a fact.
Yeah.
And now the onus is on the opponents who now you have to prove it false because we have these mountains of evidence
Yeah.
that says evolution is a fact.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that's not how it works. You have to prove it, and then it becomes a fact. So if you're saying it's a fact, there's nothing to disprove because it's a fact. But if you're putting the onus on us to disprove it, then that means it's still a theory. And of course, science doesn't work that way. Science doesn't work where you put the onus on the other party to prove you wrong. You have to actually prove the statement. If it's a statement of an indicative
Hypothesis.
statement,
Oh.
yeah. If it's a statement of fact, if it's an indicative statement, then you have to actually prove it. But you can't say something and then say, "Prove me wrong." That's the same thing as me saying, "Sam, you're a murderer," and I go, "Prove me wrong." I was like, "What? What? No, I don't have to do that."
Right.
And so
I'm
those
not.
are some kind of thing. So I just want to give you some of the stuff right from the get go where we have also been inundated growing up in our education system where evolution is the fact, it's the basis, it's the foundation,
Yeah.
right? And then everybody who disagrees with it, you better have proof that you disagree with it. So all these people that we're seeing, apologists, scientists, whatever, that are trying to defend creation are now thinking, oh, I need to defend or I need to kind of prove them wrong. I mean, that's not how science works, but that's where we are now, and I get it, and I'm happy to oblige. So we can start with that. I just want to start with that notion.
Mm-hmm. But just kind of in response to what you were just talking about, don't people that do believe in evolution, don't they come up with this because there are scientific facts? Because there are scientific facts that we can see, there are fossils that we can see that we can date to a certain period in the Earth's history. And I read an interesting thing from this book that I read, which I could actually link to in our description. But there are fossils of dinosaurs, of humans, of mammals, not found in the same time period. And so, for example, even in their fossil records that scientists have found, they see fossils containing unicellular organisms appear. And then later on down the line, they see fossils of multicellular and unicellular organisms appear.
Mm-hmm.
And they see fossils of dinosaurs appearing at a certain period, followed much later by fossils of humans. And so we see that throughout the history of the Earth, there are different organisms that have existed in different time periods. And so when we look at the evidence, it seems to point to the fact that, sure, I guess there actually might be evolution. And so when we look at scientific things like that,
Hmm.
what are we supposed to make of that? Because, I mean, as far as we know, in Genesis 1, it says that God created the heavens and the earth, God created humans, mammals, all in a span of 1 week.
Hmm.
And it doesn't seem like it's a million years apart. And
Six
so,
days.
I'm sorry, in 6 days, and they don't seem like they're a million years apart, like the science might reveal. So, how are we supposed to take two of these things and reconcile them together?
You brought up a lot of points. Can you read another quote?
Yes.
It's by Francisco Ayala, Latin American evolutionary biologist. Wrote this in a paper of his. He wrote many books on it too. Love Darwin. But before you read it, I just want to give the caveat that Darwinistic evolution was not the beginning of where people thought or wanted to kind of grab the idea that man just came up on its own. Like
Okay.
humans
Yeah.
were evolved to where we are now.
From chimpanzees or
No,
whatever.
like humans evolving was not our that it didn't originate with Darwin. Darwin took the
I see.
idea
Yeah.
and he put all this quote unquote science into it. And so he put all this evidence. He started not just extrapolating data. He started to draw conclusions and make resolutions. And so because of what he has done, this is why Francisco Ayala can write what he wrote.
And this is the quote. It was Darwin's genius to resolve this conceptual schizophrenia. Darwin completed the Copernican revolution by drawing out for biology the notion of nature as a lawful system of matter in motion that human reason can explain without recourse to supernatural agencies. The conundrum faced by Darwin can hardly be overestimated. The strength of the argument from design to demonstrate the role of the creator had been forcefully set forth by philosophers and theologians. Wherever there is function or design, we look for its author. It was Darwin's greatest accomplishment to show that the complex organization and functionality of living beings can be explained as the result of a natural process, natural selection, without any need to resort to a creator or other external agent. The origin and adaptations of organisms and their profusion and wondrous variations were thus brought into the realm of science.
So the Copernican revolution is just the 1500s when Copernicus discovered that everything doesn't revolve around us. We are actually revolving around the sun, and then all these like thought leaders who were religious thought leaders, the people that other people looked up to for instruction and guidance, actually had it wrong. That's why it's called a revolution. And so those thought processes started to come in where, like, wait a minute, these priests, they don't know everything, right?
Yeah, yeah.
These guys who are supposed to know and teach us, maybe they've been wrong. So that's the thought that would come in. And so that's what the Copernican revolution is. Um, anyway, so in the latter half of that paragraph that you read is pretty important. It talks about, when there's a design, we look for its author. But what we are finding now is because of natural selection, we don't need to resort to a creator. We don't need to look for an author or any external agent. We could actually see that all the things that were here were brought up on its own, and we're going to use science to prove it, right? Or we're going to use science to hold to that thesis. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So back to the original question about evolution. I'm sure everybody's really excited to listen to this.
This is, I think. I mean, at least for me, even when I was like in elementary school, middle school.
I mean, this is not just about what you wrote here. I see that you wrote macro, micro. Like there is microevolution, there is adaptation, there's even devolution, right? Where you devolve when you get weaker. There could be like mutations, right? And then things like that. But it's macroevolution that Christians have to have a problem with, because then you are siding with, let's say, the creator not being a necessary agent in our, coming forth, in our creation, right? Yeah.
So I guess the question is, then what do we do with this data? And I know there's a lot of different data points. What do we do with like stuff like, I don't know, like fossils?
Fossils is a big one. So fossils are that's one of the biggest ones. All these other ones, I've been reading accounts since probably when I first learned it in junior high school now. But this stuff was kind of fascinating. But the geological records and fossils, and this is not just about bringing up bones. Fossil records are just even talking about the geological records of how rocks are formed. You talk about when water came into existence, and then when oxygen started hitting the water, and things like that. So there are all these assumptions that are made, and things like the Earth is how old by certain scientific estimates.
Very old.
People think it's around 4.5 billion years old.
4.5 billion.
4.5 billion. And the universe is about what? How old? Like 13.5, right?
Yeah.
So there are all these accounts. I think as time goes on, people continue to tack on more years, but that's a different story. So number one, I think you could be on 3 sides, but maybe 4 if we count it. The first one is, let's talk about this first. We have gotten challenges over the creation story, right? So
Yeah.
the geological, so it's good that we separated. Number one is the geological records. It seems as though the fossils, meaning digging up of, like bones and things like that, they seem to be telling us some kind of story that the earth is much older than we think, right?
Yeah.
And so that's something that you'd have to probably look at. Number 2 is, even though Darwin wasn't the first evolutionist, he is the one that started putting things together. And then he put it together. So he put it together in a way that was a direct challenge to Genesis' creation story. So I think it's good to understand Genesis, but it's not only the fossil records that were dug up, but we also have archaeological records that are dug up and found, like ancient Near East, Near East, right? That area, like where Babylon was.
Right,
and
right.
They're finding creation accounts from there. Like I think in your seminary you did studies on the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Oh, how'd you know that?
Because all seminaries go through that. Because it's a challenge to Genesis. So there's the Genesis, which is the creation account. But then you're starting to see that, actually the ancient people also had another creation account, which is like the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, they all have like the flood story in it.
They
it's
do.
Very similar. And then the fourth challenge that we are starting to see is something called higher criticism. So this is when you're like, when you hear things like, actually, Paul didn't really write this part of 1 Corinthians 11 or 14, right?
Yeah.
He didn't really write these things. Someone else did. That's actually from us, it's from a discipline called higher criticism. This is where we also get JEDP. I don't know if you've ever learned that. When you look at the Torah, JEDP is a liberal study where you take the portions of the Torah, the first 5 books, in fact, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, which is the Pentateuch. You take it and then you take sections and then you split it up into genres.
Yeah.
So you actually take the modern understanding of genres and then you fit it into this ancient book, which should be confusing too, but it is what it is. And then they came up with 4 people that wrote it. So instead of Moses being the author, there were actually 4 people, and these 4 people just continue to add on to each other. And these 4 people are J, E, D, and P, right? Yeah. J is the Yahwists, E is the Elohists, D is the Deuteronomists, and then P is the priestly. And so each section of the Pentateuch they would put. So we have all these challenges to the Bible that have been going on. And so it's not just evolution.
Right.
I'm trying to show that the Bible has been challenged and it continues to be challenged over the many centuries because people just don't want to believe it. And now it's up to a point where even Richard Dawkins would say, if you believe something as archaic and old and outdated and disproven like the Bible, you should be ridiculed, right? We should ridicule these guys because we want to intellectually shame you. But is that really the case, right? Is that really the case? People like Bruce Waltke would say things like, unless we accept evolution, we are just in an intellectual cult and things of that nature.
when I was, researching this topic, I tried to read the non-Christian things first.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and their argument has always been, it's just science.
Mm-hmm.
These are the scientific evidences. Like, here's the proof. Here is the dating of these fossils. Here is the scientific proof of this theory of evolution. And how do you respond to that?
I think there are definitely questions that we don't understand, like we don't have the answer to, and even questions that, as it's being formulated, you don't know exactly how to ask these questions.
Mm-hmm.
But there are things that we do know, and those are things that can be up for discussion. That our scientific method has helped us understand a little bit more, and then we're kind of learning more along the way. But there are assumptions that are made when we make propositions like the things that the evolutionary theory does.
Mm-hmm.
Here are some evolutionary theories that are like ideas and propositions that you have to presuppose.
Okay.
And so, number one is matter comes from nothing. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
we're going to take it even back further than the biological evolution. We could get to it,
This is
but let's start
creation.
start from the very beginning. Matter comes from nothing, right?
Uh-huh.
That's one thing that has to be presupposed.
Right.
Number two, non-living material can spontaneously become living.
Yeah.
Right. Number three, one species can change to another species. Right.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And number four, we could go all the way back. And this list Al Mohler put together, I liked it, so I'm using it. But number four is explosions can produce order.
Ah, okay. The Big Bang.
Any kind of explosion can produce order, right? Has that ever been the case? And like those things. And then we go into the realm of where even R.C. Sproul goes into the philosophical realm of chance. Is chance a power? Chance isn't a power, right? He talks about chance not being an entity or a power. Chance is just chance. But you need a power to make something happen.
Right.
So what's the power? So you can't just be like, and I see that argued on both sides of the debate. It's like, well, there's like a 0.00002 like 2% chance of this happening, and so other people are like, well, you just need time then, and then I think that's like the wrong question or debate to have. The debate, even if it's 0.0 to the 50th nth degree or whatever it is, what is the power that puts it into place, right? So where's the power? Where's the movement coming from? Because of the law of causality, you can't just have something that moves from nothing. If something moves, that means something caused it, right? That's the law of causality. So who moved it? That's the big question, right? You can't just have like something that has a possibility of moving, just all of a sudden move. Just because there's a possibility doesn't mean it's going to move, right? So even if you had an infinitesimally small dot with an infinite amount of power in it, and all of a sudden the Big Bang happened, let's say that's that proposed theory, which, by the way, Stephen Hawkins says no to. But if that's the proposed theory, then who gave it the power?
Right.
So who caused it? So the law of causality has to make sense. So even with this scientific stuff, you can't take out basic philosophy. And so again, I want to point to, you want to understand that these sciences don't just exist in its own vacuum. The sciences all have to come to, that understanding. They all need to be proven together, right?
Yeah. And I was reminded by your answer here. We know that Latin phrase, ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. And so I guess if we're going even back as far as that, to where matter comes into being, that is something that evolution may have to answer to.
Yeah. And if that's the case, then all these questions about, well, can I adopt to evolution? Can I adopt an evolutionary theory and then say I'm what is it called? Evolutionary Christian? What is it?
Theistic evolution.
Theistic evolution.
Yeah.
Like old, what is it? Old Earth
Young
creationist.
Earth, old Earth.
Yeah, creationist, right? And so I remember when I was a college minister, we had like a speaker and things like that, and then so like I think our speaker didn't believe in. He was an old Earth creationist.
Okay.
And someone asked him, What about young Earth? He's like, I don't think young Earth is right. And then the person that asked him said, why not?
Yeah.
Right. But, he's like, because of all this evidence that we have, it's probably not, and things like that.
Hmm.
So I think there are people who even listen to this, even in our church, that could be both young and old, but there is a right and wrong. And I think hopefully by the end of this podcast, we can clearly say this one's most likely. Are you scared of what
I'm
I'm going
not
to say?
scared, but
Yeah, we'll see. Let's start from the beginning, and let's put everything back on the table. If that's the case, then we can't adopt things like what Francis Collins would say. We'll lose our evangelism if we continue to put ourselves as anti-intellectualism.
Mm.
If someone comes to us and is like, "Oh my gosh, you don't believe in evolution, right? You don't believe that we came from an amoeba or something like that,
Oh yeah.
then you must be an anti-intellectual."
Yep.
I think anybody that knows us knows that is far from the case of it being true, but we want to talk about maybe even interpretations or the philosophy behind it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, are there any good things about this? Is there anything that makes it weak?
So I mean, you brought up young Earth, old Earth. You brought up theistic evolution, which are all things that I actually wanted to go over today. I think when we talk about theistic evolution, people that believe in this theory are people that believe that God has created um, ex nihilo, out of nothing. God has created,
Hmm.
and from the point of that creation, how the creature evolves, that's the question that they try to answer with theistic evolution, right? So, for
Hmm.
example, there are, and this is from Desiring God, but there are two different viewpoints of theistic evolution. One is that God created, and then after that, it was kind of like let nature do its own thing. So it
Hmm.
just kind of evolved on its own,
Hmm.
kind of like on autopilot in a sense. And the other view is that God has acted initially to create the world, but continues to be active and be involved throughout the development of all that exists. So he oversees natural selection, he oversees speciation, he oversees these random mutations. So they're not actually random.
Like a deist.
Like a deist, but I guess in this sense, they believe that God has created and continues to develop these creatures through evolution. So one is God created, let nature do its own thing. Second is God created. God is using evolution. God works through evolution, is active through evolution to see the product being what it is now.
Yeah. And so there are tons of theological and exegetical, not only complications, but there are some things that cannot be resolved with that kind of thinking.
Uh huh.
And I'll tell you why, because most of you who are listening probably understand the redemptive narrative that the Bible has, okay?
Yeah.
So, those are questions that, if you do believe this, if you do believe that, even in the deistic sense that God is the great clockmaker, he set everything in order and then these things came to be. And then you would think then some obvious questions are things like, did death come before the fall?
That
Is
is something that
is
they talk about. Yeah.
yeah, is Adam the a historic person, or
Mm.
is Adam just a myth?
Mm.
Okay. I'll just take those two. Let's run with those two. If death came before the fall, then how did death come without sin entering into the world,
Yeah. Right. Right.
as the Bible dictates? That comes. You have a ton of problems, and I'm talking to Christians here. I'm not talking to non-Christians, because non-Christians, the answer is pretty easy. The Bible's not true, right?
Yeah.
But if you believe the Bible is true, and then you believe in this theistic evolution, uh, death has to have come for things to evolve, right? And so, how did everything first come to be?
Mm.
And then God is going to make it a certain way where he introduces death. He introduces natural selection, which is not Christian, which is not a character that God actually endorses. In fact, he doesn't like uh, survival of the fittest. In fact, talks about helping the poor,
Hmm.
helping those that are in need. He talks about taking care of what's out there. That's not evolution. That's not natural selection, as Darwin would hope that that's how we got to where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, if the historic, if the, and some people actually that I've talked to don't believe in the historical Adam. If you don't believe in the historical Adam, then you don't have a redemptive story. You don't have the gospel because Jesus is the second Adam.
Right.
There's no second Adam if there wasn't a first Adam.
Right.
There's all these like arbitrary intellectual jumps that you have to do if you hold to evolution. If you're taking sola scriptura, then you have to make all these jumps, and you're just going to collide with yourself on with these ideas that you have, because you won't have the historical and redemptive narrative that the Bible purports. Things like, let's say they believe in a historical Adam, but what really happened was the amoeba, and it grew into this, this crustacean, and then it became this land animal, blah blah blah. And then you go into the hominids, right? And then you have evolution, and then it's split up into the Neanderthals, and then we have the Homo sapiens and things like that. Let's say you hold to this, and then you're going to say, well, then God came in, and then he took one of the hominids and said, I'm going to pick you as Adam. What happened to the others? So the others do not have the image of God, right? Because when he said, the Bible clearly states that when God created man, he created man in his image. He created them male and female, right?
Yep.
And so when he created man in his image. So if you don't believe in the historical Adam, you don't have to redemptive story. But if you're an evolutionist, if you're old age evolutionist, you say there's a historical Adam, what about the rest? And where does death come into play? So there are all these mental and intellectual jumps that are arbitrary that you'll have to make in your head to try to make it fit the narrative you wanted to make. So I'm saying philosophically you have issues, and also theologically you already have issues with evolution. And we didn't even get to the fossil records yet, but you already have these things. So if sola scriptura, that means we're going to begin with the scriptures. If that's where we're going to begin, you already know that evolution is going to give you huge problems, because it's not only that evolution, so Darwinistic evolution was presented to the Western world as an alternative to the Christian gospel. That's a fact. And so this is what Darwin wanted to do. Things like, this is what like people like Nietzsche and Marx wanted to do. They wanted to give an alternative utopia to the biblical understanding of utopia, of heaven. Marx thought, it would come here. Friedrich Nietzsche thought, wanted to take out and then go back into, I wanted to see everything's transcendent, and go into, eventually what people would adopt as nihilism. But those things are not Christian. He's the one that, I guess a lot of deists would also like, because he believes that we killed God. We're talking about Nietzsche here, right? That we as humans, we killed God, and that we don't need him anymore, and things like that. And so there's a lot of questions that are now open that are going to invade your faith because of it. At least we can admit that, right?
Yeah.
Before we move on. Okay.
So what you're saying is, first you mentioned Romans 5:12, and this is, I think, where we see the verse of death, right? Romans 5:12 reads, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." We see that sin causes death to come into the world, right? And so death could not have happened prior to sin. Therefore, the human being, Adam, who was the first sinner, Adam who not allowed, but who through his sin had death come into the world, he would have had to have been made before anything died, is what you're saying, correct? So that's one, the point that you made about death, and then also the point that you made about historic Adam, the need for historic Adam, because like you said, if Christ truly is the second Adam and he was a historic person, then there is absolutely a need for historic Adam. The first Adam, I don't know what his last name was, but Adam
the first,
to be a real historic being. And you also talked about Genesis 1, where Adam had to have been made by God from the dust, and it wasn't an evolution thing. From the beginning, God made man from the dust, and this was the historic Adam. This was the historic Adam that sinned and brought death into the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more problems than that. Even if you look at art, even if you are in the realm of teleology, of where we're going
Yeah.
or what we're headed toward, the Bible talks about the lion and the lamb lying together, right?
Mhm.
If there was predation before the fall, before Adam fell, meaning animals were preying on each other and there was death,
Yeah.
that line doesn't make any sense at all. Does that make sense? Before the creation of Adam, if animals are preying on each other, then that line doesn't make any sense, because where does that go? It doesn't fit anywhere. There's so many holes. If you hold on to sola scriptura, and that's what you're going to hold on to first as your primary source, and you just can't hold on to things like that,
Yeah.
right? So there's a lot of problems, and then people in the past have tried to mix the two. People like Galileo, other people have done it, thinking that they were kind of using the Bible, but what they try to do is they try to elevate other things to the level of the Bible, like the Catholics did with Scripture. They did with they try to elevate tradition to it. Galileo tried to lift up nature
Yeah.
to the equal level of Scripture, which is what I think that some people in their they want to be intellectually honest or things like that. They want to think that, if I just fully hold on to this creation view, I'm being anti-intellectual, without seeing all the holes in their own theory that they're subscribing to. But I think that's what it basically is again, Richard Dawkins is famously noted to have said, evolution is what allows a person to be intellectually fulfilled atheists. So this is what you can hold on to, be like, look, I'm not an idiot for being an atheist because of evolution. So evolution is something that people hold on to desperately, and that's for a reason. And it's not just simply an intellectual reason. I really do believe it is a spiritual reason why people hold on to it. And this is what we want to address, I suppose. But yeah, there are a lot of theological, exegetical, biblical complications and problems that you will run into if you do not hold on to the historical Adam of the Bible.
So it seems like even in our conversation, the way that you're going about and answering these questions and the way that you're going about and thinking about these questions is through the lens of the Bible. And so you're going through the Bible, you're seeing the world as the Bible tells us, and you're saying this is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. And I think that's something that we have to note, because when we have this type of conversation about evolution, many times Christians would either look through the lens of science and say, oh, this is kind of iffy about the Bible. I don't know about that because this is what science says. Or they hold the Bible and science on equal planes and they try to reconcile the two. They try to see which one is right based on what their idea of right is and based on the evidence. And so I guess, could you just explain to us, could you just explain to us how we can have this mindset, how we can view questions like this with a Christian worldview, kind of like you have been discussing because you're looking through the lens of the Bible. How do we do that?
I think it really saves us from this desperate mentality of this having to, this has to be right. Otherwise, I lose my bearings. I'm done, right? Like the atheist. I'm done. If evolution is wrong, then I am done. That kind of thing. It has to be right. And so if you have a foundation on God's word, you believe in Christ, then you could actually look at these things from with an objective lens. I'll give you a quick example. Hopefully it's not something that is too heady. It's not. Trust me, it's not. I'm no scientist. And some people who are scientists might listen and be like, yo. Well, anyway. But let's talk about how evolutionists are trying to figure out, look, it was 4.5 billion years old. How the Earth came to be, we don't even know.
Yeah.
So, but then if you really want to go all the way back, you have to figure out where all these hinges started to connect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you have all these gaps in your theory, and now you're trying to purport it as fact, which just isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
I get it. The fossil records can be confusing. Somebody just asked me about dinosaur fossils and what we are to make of it and things like that. But let's just take the Earth is 3.5, 4.5 billion years old, whatever it is. When did we start to have oxygen? And so that's something that evolutionists or an evolutionary theorists are trying to come up with. And these are not stupid people; these are smart people. Okay.
Yeah.
And so people from MIT, people from Harvard, people are all trying to figure this thing out. And so if you want oxygen where there is no oxygen, you have to get it from somewhere. The Earth didn't just have oxygen, it was just a big rock in space. So how did oxygen come to be? So first, there has to be life that doesn't need oxygen, right? And this life has to produce something of oxygen. So because, let's just say, for argument's sake, there was already water. Somehow water got on this rock, right? And so water got on this rock. We have the sun. I don't know how it came to be, but it just came to be.
Yeah.
And then you have the question of how's oxygen going to come? So then the theorists will just have to postulate right from that get-go. How do we have photosynthesis without any organisms alive? Maybe then we have an evolution of these single cell structures that go up to where we have bacteria. I'm going to call it cyanobacteria, okay? Cyanobacteria that can actually take water that was already on the earth, sunlight that's coming, and then they know how to create oxygen. They know how to split the atoms, right? From the H2O to just O, and then put O into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
You'll need a ton of bacteria, but you know how much bacteria you need to fill the earth with oxygen so that more life can.
Right.
Let's get around it. Let's just say there is all this time to happen. That's why it needs to be around 4.5 billion now.
Yeah.
So you have these billions of years now. This bacteria is just producing oxygen. So how did these bacteria come to place? So one of the things that is postulated that if you are someone, that studies this stuff, this is something that in the 19th century, Charles Lyell would, I think, coin. I think it's him. It's uniformitarianism.
Yeah.
And that's where we understand that the way we study and observe physical processes is a constant guide to how physical processes have always operated. So what we see now must have operated the exact same way 10 years ago.
Gotcha.
Or 20 years ago.
Yep.
4.5 billion years ago.
Yep.
So it needs to be consistent. If it's not consistent, and this is a key to understanding all of this. If it's not consistent, then none of this works. Okay? The way we observe things now has to be exactly the same way we could observe it 4.5 billion years ago. So if that is consistent, then what we go down to, and I said it would be a short one, but anyway, we take the bacteria that we see now and we need to do like a family tree all the way back to the beginning. And so what they're doing is people like at MIT, they're using like supercomputer power to start going down this, like family tree level of all these genomes going from this bacteria that could go all the way back. And so this is like very high tech, very, very like deep scientific stuff. So they're not just making stuff up. They actually have genomes that they've mapped and that they're going to track down. Okay. Yeah. What they're finding now is you have these trees of bacteria, and to go down, actually, these characteristics don't fit with this other bacteria, which happened like a few 100,000 years ago. These characters actually don't go together here. So they've now coined something called horizontal gene transfer. So that's something like, I'll give you just a very rudimentary example of this. Let's say you have curly hair.
Oh, I do.
Yeah. And let's say you have parents. That means one of them has the curly hair gene, right?
Yeah.
So if either of them didn't have curly hair gene, could you have curly hair?
No.
Horizontal gene transfer says yes.
What is that? What is horizontal?
That means it could jump from another tree to you. So let's say instead of Reverend Yang, and then your mother, Mrs. Yang, doesn't have the curly hair gene, but all of a sudden you have curly hair.
Yeah.
But let's say Reverend Kim and Mrs. Kim, who are my parents, they have a curly hair gene. My mom does. And so that gene jumps to you. That's called horizontal gene
How does
transfer.
that make any sense?
How does that make any sense? Is right. How does that make any sense? Is right. But they have to do that.
Uh-huh.
So if you're desperately trying to figure, and these are brilliant scientists, by the way,
Yeah.
that are trying to make these things work. They just have to skip steps. There's no other way,
Yeah.
because you're not going to get to the conclusion you want to get with what you have. I think it really boils down to this philosophical point, and it really is a spiritual point. People ultimately want to know how we came to be.
Uh-huh.
Why is that? Because if you understand how we came to be, you know where we're going. If you don't understand how we came to be, then we're
true.
in la la land.
true.
It's chaos right now. What
Yeah.
you're seeing here is chaos, but it's not chaos. There's order. Order by definition means there's a designer. Designer means there's a purpose. What's the purpose, right? And so those are things that people are grappling with, that now atheists want to claim without a creator. And this is these are the holes that they have. Look, I get it. There are some things that no one knows the answers to. And you can ask me about certain things that I will say I actually won't know, I think, until I get to heaven. I get it. But the problems are huge on the other side, not our side. The problems are huge on these people who believe in theistic evolution. There's just too many jumps that are taking place, and you're foregoing much of the theological richness that the Bible purports and gives us by adopting this. I don't think I'm making light of it. I'm not diminishing it. I hope. I really am trying to raise it to the level of seriousness that it is.
I think I'm going to tweet that.
What?
Why do people want to know where we come from? Because they want to know where we're going. That's a good tweetable bar. But I mean, again, I with that too, the reason why I asked you this question is I wanted to emphasize the point that Christians should be looking through the lens of the Bible. I think too many times we try to balance the Bible with other things, but like you were saying, Christians, we need to look through the lens of the Bible and evaluate other things. Like, this should be our standard of evaluating other things. The Bible shouldn't be one of the many standards that we use, but the Bible should be the standard, the only standard. So we talked a little bit about theistic evolution, and that's the thing too. I think, you just said that sometimes there's questions that we won't know the answers to. And I think that's a huge part of why people might be confused. We brought up fossil records before. You brought up dinosaurs before. Like, how are we even, what is a healthy way of looking at this? I mean, obviously there's things that we can't understand. There's things that we can't answer, like dinosaurs. I personally have no idea about dinosaurs. Perhaps you do. But I guess with questions that we can't answer right now, is that reason to panic? How do we think through questions that we can't answer?
Yeah, I think there will always be questions that we can't answer. It brings us to a place of humility. Look, I still read this stuff because I am curious, I like what other people might consider trivia, but it's just because I think it's fascinating. It points to design and glory of God. It really does. How do we know what a second is? How do we know what's 24 hours?
What is 24 hours?
What's 24 hours?
It's, when the clock hits 12 twice. That's 24 hours.
It's not exact, right? People thought,
What do you mean?
when Earth makes one revolution, like one turn, right?
Yeah.
That's 24 hours. That's a day. It's not really true. The Earth is slowing down ever so slightly, but it is slowing down, which points to that means the Earth was faster before. Time was a little different before.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Ever so slight. Even if you think about it in the billions of years schematic, whatever it is, all that stuff is awesome to me. So what is the closest thing that we can get to a second? How do we know we have an objective second? Because it changes, right? So you take like a cesium atom, and then how many times it resonates or reverberates. That's what we'll calculate as a second. And scientists are doing all of this stuff. For me, that stuff is fascinating. I get it. But what Darwinism really does, and Daniel Dennett really has a poignant story about it in his book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and what it really is pointing to. And he talks about this universal acid. It's a fantasy that Dennett writes about. That let's say there is this acid, and we'll call it universal acid. But let's say there's this acid that can eat through anything. Okay, and there's no container that could even hold it.
Mm-hmm.
So you just have this substance. Obviously, that kind of substance doesn't exist, but whatever it comes near, it just corrodes, it destroys, and just you know
Yeah.
melts everything in
Yeah.
its wake. Dennett says that is actually Darwin's evolution. What it does, we're not recognizing, philosophically speaking. What Darwin's idea really has done is it started to eat every other thought that was out there,
Yeah.
and it started to make its own. This is the primary thought. And people are now yelling, "This is science! This is science! This is science!" When, like I've just showed, there are so many gaps already in this theory. We could go through every single step, and the more I read about it, I feel like people in these brilliant institutions, these brilliant minds of IQs way higher than mine, what they're really doing is they're just writing a science fiction novel because they just have to guess. It's like, well, I guess to get to the anthropod level, we went from 4 to 2. Maybe we were crossing a river and we needed to hold our goods over our head because the river was high. So we're like, hey, look, I could walk on 2 legs instead of 4. 2 seems more efficient. Let's keep it that way. What? Like, that's science fiction stuff, right? How did we go from 4-legged animals to 2?
Yeah.
What would possess any 4-legged animal to be like, I like 2 better?
Yeah.
And so, where did you come up with this stuff,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I like reading that stuff because, I like science fiction. But, I like it when you kind of tickle the brain too. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, it just doesn't replace the meaning of life that God gives us through His Word. It just doesn't replace it, and that's exactly what it's trying to do. And that's what I'm saying is the dangerous part. We could talk about each step and talk about all these things where it falls short. Maybe some of them is good, some of them are good, but I just don't think so.
So when we think about evolution, um, is any part of it compatible with the Christian faith?
I think some people have said the micro part is good, the macro part is bad. Pretty simplistic, a simple way of not simplistic, a simple way of answering that. But basically, what evolution is trying to do is this: it's taking what we see here. It's like what Dawkins says. You go into a crime scene, right? And then you've seen the murder's already been committed. And so what the investigator does, what the detective does, as you've seen in many like shows or movies, is they try to backtrack and try to figure out what exactly happened so that we ended up in this place, right? And so there are some processes that we see are good. Like they'll do it, but then when they jump from one place to another, it's because they want to end up in a place where it doesn't exist. So there are biases here that I think we should also acknowledge. Just as the Christian has a bias that we hold scripture first, the atheist also has a bias where they want to get to a place without uh, intervention, without theistic intervention. And we have hopefully already established that simple theistic intervention does not give the answers to where we are now, right?
Yeah.
So we can't just say God just intervened these things because it wouldn't be the God of the Bible. It would be some other, you know, theism.
Mm.
But yeah, it wouldn't be the God of the Bible, where the God of the Bible will go out of His character to produce the things that we have now, like natural selection. It's out of His character. Okay.
So I think I keep on coming back to this question, and perhaps this is a question that we could say is unanswerable on this side of heaven. But what do we do with this evidence? What do we do with it? I mean, there's so much of it, not even just fossil records, like how people date stuff like carbon dating,
Mm-hmm.
and like you brought up before, like dinosaur fossils. Like, uh, I don't like, when they find fossils of hominids, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do we, how are we supposed to do that? Because I mean, we see pictures of these things. Like we see these things with our own eyes. We see it being like a reality. And so,
Mm-hmm.
as a Christian, understanding that we're looking through the lens of the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that God created man out of the dust and made man in his own image. What do we do with these evidences that seem to possibly contradict? We know it doesn't, right? Because it can't contradict the Bible. But how do we reconcile it? I think that's something that people still might have difficulty trying to think over.
Mm-hmm. I think when we continue to try to gather evidence, it's just, again, you stay humble. Things like the first fossil we found, like the early human fossil, like Lucy,
Oh, the hominid.
is fake, right? People put it together.
Oh, wait,
It's
what?
it's not what it
Lucy
seems.
was fake?
Yeah.
Why would they do such a thing?
Well, wonder why would people do such a thing,
Because they
right?
hate God.
Anyway, people still hold to it. People still want to believe it. When it comes out as a phony, it doesn't make as much news as when it comes out and people are like,
Mm,
"Oh, this is real." Well, some of the fossil, I'm not saying all. I think a lot of it is genuine. So don't get me wrong. Some of them are fake, and
mhm,
so we got to continue to use our scientific process and try to be, hold to it with integrity. And over time, we'll see who's been fake or not. But we'll just continue to search and we'll continue to learn. We'll continue to find out, what is real, what is not. I just think that the reason why we hold on to the Bible is because it is through the Word of God that we actually understand logic, reason. We understand all these principles like righteousness, justice, equity. We understand wisdom. We understand what knowledge is.
mm,
So, all these guiding principles, the basis and foundation of living is there in the Word. And science and all that stuff isn't outside of the Bible's realm, it's under it. And that's why we can have other things like other sciences that we can continue to study and discover. And that's why it's exciting, right? That's why you could have voluminous amount of works on just what's out there in the universe, because that's how crazy it is. And even thinking things like we haven't even um, gone to the deepest like recesses of the earth. We haven't gone down to the bottom of the deepest oceans, right?
mm.
And so we're still discovering things, which is exciting in my opinion.
Interesting. Even yeah, because I didn't know that Lucy was a fake.
Yeah, and it's still in our textbooks. That's what's frustrating to me. It's still in our textbooks like it's fact or something. Yeah, there's all this stuff that's out there. Even the second one that they found. I mean, I don't have all this information in front of me, but I guess, people can fact check it.
Interesting.
Like even dinosaurs. It's all speculation, right? How we put those bones together, how we imagine that they have reptilian skin.
Yeah.
It's all imagination, right?
Right. Right. Right.
How we fill in some of the things to think that they're actually the dense bones where it could have been hollowed out bones. You don't know that. There's theories out there that they were actually feathered, and then there's theories out there that maybe they were just birds. Yeah, I
Mhm.
don't know. And so we're still figuring things out, is my point. Um, so, yeah, dinosaurs, most likely, according to most evolutionary biologists, they would say did not look like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park.
So you're telling me it was fake, and they keep on making money off those movies.
It's just, these things are the things that we continue to learn.
Mm.
But when you take it as fact, when it's not fact, that's where the folly begins. When people like Richard Dawkins are saying this is fact, right? It's like, oh, which part? What are you saying is fact? You're saying the whole thing that all these evolutionary biologists are now purporting, which they don't even agree on. All of this is fact. What are you saying is fact? Just the fact that we came from a single cell organism. Well, I'll disagree with you right there because we don't even have all the letters in between to get to where we are now. That's not fact. Um, yeah, this is just a theory. I think we're trying to put science behind it, but yeah, I don't believe it.
So would we then, as Christians, say that as Christians, the absolute truth that we know to be absolutely true is the Word of God, and that's what we trust?
That has been proven.
Yep.
That is a fact. The Word of God has proven itself true. The resurrection of Christ proves it. These are things that are, there's hard evidence. There's testimony. There's eyewitness accounts. There's writings from the time that have been traced back. There's all these things that we hold on to. It is a historical event that happened. Also, not only is it a historical event that happened, it's been written in the scriptures for thousands of years, predating the actual event, that have been prophesying of what was to come that
Yeah.
actually came about. I think we have good reason to believe what the Bible says. And I think what's amazing is that when you have all this evidence in front of you and people don't believe, then you recognize what God also wrote in His Word is true. That just because you're smart doesn't mean you'll get it. Just because you're rich doesn't mean you'll get it either. In fact, it is a stumbling block for the Jews, and it was folly to the Gentiles.
Mm.
And that, in fact, proved to be true. But in fact, this is the wisdom of God that He shows to prove that what no one could have fathomed, no one could have even imagined the story, God had already designed, and it came into being. And that's basically what it comes down to. And when we go back to the creation account, the interpretation of Genesis, what we believe is that it is a supernatural event. That means it's a miracle, right? That's the only way it could have happened. And that's what we hold to. And that's why the whole 24 days, the 24-hour days thing is not a big deal to me, because if it's a miracle, then it's a miracle, right? I was talking with somebody in Japan who just couldn't hold to, and he was a physics guy. He just couldn't believe Genesis 1. He was like, oh, this Bible stuff is good. I just can't get around Genesis 1.
Yeah.
And then he's like, look, you're a physicist. Let me talk to you about some rudimentary physics. We know that the Earth is slowing down. That means it was sped up before, right? That it was faster before.
Mm-hmm.
So if God did speed it up and turned it and just became slow, how do you know that it really didn't happen in a day and it was just really fast and God just slowed it down?
Mm-hmm.
You don't know that, right? And it does seem as though time then would have been, been affected differently. And we started talking about light and how the perception of light is all into effect depending on where the source is and how we're coming from, all this stuff, right? And he was fascinated by what I was saying, because at that time I just read a book on it. So I was lucky, right? But then I shared all these things with him, and he's like, actually, that makes sense. But that goes all the way back to the whole Lyell quote, like how we observe physical processes now had to have been how we would have observed it or operated back then, which is a huge assumption, right? It's an assumption that we have to make anything work. I get it. But when we go back to the creation account, the Bible tells us in the beginning, God. So it's a miracle of God that we exist, that out of nothing, something came. That's what God did, right?
So you said all of that in Japanese, huh?
No, he spoke in English.
Oh,
That's crazy if I said in Japanese.
I wasn't sure. I think with this episode, we wanted to make sure that we have this introduction in this foundation in seeing the world through the lens of the Word. There was a quote that I read that was wrong, and it was said by Pope John Paul II. He said, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each one can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish." And I think you said it before. Science is something that serves our faith. Science is merely revealing slowly what God has done. And so science does not stand on the same field as the Word of God, but subservient to it. And so as Christians, I think it's an important reminder that we have to view the world through the lens of the Bible and not anything else. Any other introductory comments that you would like to make as we close today?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the questions that might be posed is, and there's a great talk that Al Mohler did that you could look up. It's called "Why Does the Universe Look So Old?" But I'll give you a little heads up on what it is. I think he did it at a Ligonier conference a few years back. But one of the reasons why the universe looks so old is because I think what he said there was brilliant is because God made it whole.
Mm.
So out of nothing, what came was not a fetus. Out of nothing, what came was somebody whole, right? Adam wasn't created as a fetus. Adam wasn't created as a baby. Adam was created at a perfect ripe age, what we would see as a perfect ripe age, which is 43. But it was just created. And the universe wasn't created like as a rock and it grew. Universe just was created. God made it whole.
Mm.
A garden wasn't just a bunch of seeds. Garden was the garden.
Yeah.
And Adam had to manage it. So God created the universe whole. And that's one reason why the universe may look old to people who are drawing observations now. And number two, what the Bible says about the world is true. The world is groaning because of sin.
Mm.
And maybe that's why it also looks old. And that's
Stress.
something that, that's something that we always take into account. Death has affected the universe.
Yeah.
It has affected creation. So sin has affected the creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I get it that creation, and something that I get is creation is a miracle, and the how is only known by God, just as any miracle is, right? If someone is miraculously healed, you don't know the hows, but you
Right.
know it's something that God has done. But what Darwinistic evolution has done is, what it really inserts is our existence has no purpose, has no meaning, because we didn't just come out of designer. We just came into being, right? And I think that is truly what has harmed our whole world, adopting this crazy idea and then saying this is scientific and then teaching in our schools as such without giving any of its criticisms, so people can take it in with a more objective view. Because, like I said, some of the processes and stuff, that's stuff we can learn from, right? Some of the formulas that are used, some of the math that's used, that's stuff that we can use for other things as well. Like a base is a base. But yeah, what it purports, that has too many holes. It's really difficult for me to subscribe to. And just to say that if you don't subscribe to, you're anti-intellectual, then you're going to ad hominem. And so I would say for the Christian out there, I think we can be confident that what the Word of God says is true, and you don't have to feel dumb for believing it. In fact,
Yeah.
I think it is the most intellectual thing that you can think of, and side with, and it has good ground. We have a God that does love us, has created us, that has appointed a time and a purpose for us to be here, and it's up to us to stand strong and firm for the faith of what God has called us to proclaim. So let's do that.
So what you're saying is that the chicken came first, is what Christians believe.
Yeah.
We thank you for that, and I think this is a big topic for perhaps many listeners, and so we will be continuing not just the topic of evolution, but really on creation. I think a lot of questions might come up. Was the Earth really created in 6 days, or was it, as some people believe, over millions of years that were 6 days to God, or something like that? And so we'll be going over these things, and we'll actually even be talking about something that my dear friend and previous professor Jonathan Gibson said. So
Cool.
I wish we could have him on, but I'm too nervous to ask.
If you're listening, come on, bro.
We thank you for listening to this episode of the Dear Church podcast. Join us next week as we continue this conversation of creation in Genesis 1 and 2. We hope and pray that this has been a blessing in your ears. As always, and until the end of time, we love you. We miss you. Bye.
Bye.